What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be doing some black and white street photography breakdowns, looking at some of my photographs that I've been making over the past 2.5 years using the Ricoh GR3 and high contrast black and white. And so these are all straight out of camera JPEG files that I've been making and experimenting with, and I'm really having fun with this process, and I'm eager to share with you some of the results. And so here's my first example, boy in Logan Square. This was actually the first photograph I made during the 2022 Thanksgiving Day Parade with this current setup that I'm using. And so during the parades, I like to find myself on the peripherals of the event itself. I don't necessarily like to photograph the action, but what's going on around the outside. And so when this event unfolded, I was drawn and gravitated towards this scene of these children playing upon this beautiful sculpture. And I felt the potential of photograph here because of the playful energy. The background was clean. And I think the challenge with photographing parade and events is it's very difficult to find a very strong background or a strong way to separate the moment from the chaos. And so the thing I look for a lot of the times on the street is gestures. And I'm very drawn to the playful energy of the youth. And so when I saw this boy up on top of the sculpture playing, looking at his hand, I was triggered and pressed the shutter. And so that gesture really drew me in. But it was the sculptural element of this Native American man that I found to be an intriguing backdrop and an intriguing element to work upon and set my stage. And so as this Native American man, this beautiful sculpture, is gazing out to the right-hand side of the frame with his hands outstretched. We have the boy gazing back at his hand. And so there's this interesting thing that happens in this frame very spontaneously through your intuition. When you see a gesture and you press the shutter, sometimes you'll be surprised at the way that other elements sort of align subconsciously without you really planning anything. And so here in this frame we have the boy looking at his hand, we have two of the Native Americans' hands, and there's this gesture, this spiral of gestures that occur. As you can see, I highlight here in green the different gestures throughout the frame. And so look for gestures when you're on the streets. Gestures are a very simple trigger to look for. If people are stretching their hands out, going to yawn, maybe people are laughing, crying, kissing. Gestures are very beautiful, and I think a very simple trigger to look for when you're on the streets. And so if things are moving, if people are moving, if hands are out, I'm intrigued and I'm going to make a photograph. And so once again, this photograph came through my intuition, through me recognizing a very spontaneous boy sort of playing upon a sculpture, and the moment the hand outstretched, I was triggered to press the shutter. And so example number 2, we have the blanket on JFK Boulevard. So here in Philadelphia, I was walking outside of Love Park, and I noticed this man walking towards the park with his blanket on his back. And the moment itself was not that interesting, frankly. I thought, okay, it's just a man with a blanket over him. It's a cold day. This isn't necessarily something worth photographing. But I did it anyway, because what happened was, as he turned the corner and I was watching him cross the street, I noticed the relationship that I could make between the lines on the crosswalk and the man's blanket. And so there was this interesting element of the backdrop combining with the foreground that really drew me in to press the shutter here. And so as you can see, we have the obvious moment of the blanket. There's this beautiful shape that's formed. It's almost ghost-like. And I find it to be just an interesting abstract shape in relationship to those lines in the background of the crosswalk. The key thing to highlight here was the way in which I made the photograph and the relationships that I made very quickly and intuitively. So essentially with the Ricoh, you use an LCD screen to make photographs. And so it was very easy for me to raise the camera a little bit higher than eye level to then separate the subject from the background. And so the art of street photography composition comes down to eliminating distractions. And so we want to eliminate all of the superfluous details and focus on what truly matters in our frame to create something with visual impact. And so here in this photograph, we have the man with the blanket in relationship to those leading lines that I made very quickly this decision by positioning my body and my camera up at a higher vantage point to separate him from the background. Otherwise, if I were to photograph from a low angle or a little bit lower than this angle, there would be too much distracting elements in the background, and you wouldn't have that clean separation of this abstract shape of the ghostly figure in relationship to those lines. And so example number 3, we have the woman in Queens. And so I spent about a weekend in New York City, and I went to Queens for the first time walking around, and I found it to be a very interesting place to photograph. And so I very quickly made this photograph. Actually, the way in which I made this photograph was through the T-Rex technique. Look at youtube.com, Dante Sisofo T-Rex technique. It's a very stealthy street photography technique that I pretty much picked up just naturally using the Ricoh, where I hold the camera to my side and I look at the LCD screen through the corner of my eye, having an understanding of the composition that I'm making. So it's kind of like shooting from the hip, but it's a very spontaneous way to photograph, and I kind of had to use that technique in this moment because in these environments, people don't really want their photograph taken, right? And so I had to make this composition and this photographic decision of hunting with speed very quickly. And so I kind of shot from the hip, and things align very naturally with the 28mm, and I find it very easy to shoot this way using this focal length. And so obviously we have in the foreground of the frame this woman's gesture looking to the left-hand side, which was a striking foreground element to include. In relationship to the two girls on the left and the right, one going inside, one on the outside smoking a cigarette. You know, we have these strong gestures of the woman holding her jeans. You know, there's an interesting gritty atmosphere with this backdrop here, separating these subjects cleanly from those fences, or rather garage doors and doorways. And so with this kind of photography, when you're in these environments, it's really critical for you to work with speed and don't hesitate. You know, if you feel fear within you to make a picture, just make the picture. Actually, it's a good sign when you feel that, because hesitation leads to stagnation. But if you feel fear and you go forward with courage, you will improve your photography and you will make more interesting photographs because you take risks. And so respond with speed when you're on the street. If you see something that interests you, just make the picture and move on. Don't hesitate. Continue going down the street with courage and confidence, and allow that fear to almost guide you, where the more risks you take, the better photography, the more risks you take, the better photographs you will make, essentially. And so example number 4, we have nuns in Rome. And so I was walking around the Vatican here in Rome, and I found that the nuns were just very intriguing to photograph. You know, the beautiful textures of their clothing, and, you know, the light was beautiful. It was around the golden hour, the sun was setting, and I was intrigued. And so I was following these nuns around, and I saw them very quickly crossing the street. And I wound up making a picture of just the nuns, and I was focused on the nuns from behind, making a simple photograph of them. However, by waiting patiently and being observant and working this scene where I was photographing very intensely at this moment, making vertical frames, making horizontal frames, observing this pair, observing these two nuns, as they were waiting to cross the street, the person in front of me went to reach back and itch her shoulder. And so this very spontaneous gesture I responded to quickly, and I had to, because it was a very fleeting moment. And so one of the things that I do with my Ricoh is I have the FN button on the back of the camera set to single point autofocus or snap focus. And so I can go back and forth very quickly from snap focus to single point autofocus. And actually I made this photograph with the Ricoh GR 3X. So this one was with the 40mm. And at this moment, I very quickly had to respond. It was maybe like 2 or 5 seconds that I had to make this decision of including the hand within the frame. And so I clicked the FN button, went to single point autofocus so that I could lock in focus very closely at this gesture, because it is very close in proximity. And so I nailed the focus really quickly, adjusted the composition to include the two nuns, and then we have this very beautiful photograph where I essentially just followed the light, and then, you know, found myself in the right place at the right time, observing two nuns, interesting characters to work with, interesting subject matter, beautiful light. It was just missing that last final piece. And so we have the light, that's number 1. We have the subject, that's number 2. Now I'm just waiting for that third element to fill the frame. I'm waiting for that gesture, that thing that will actually uplift this mundane moment to a new height, that being the hand. And so we have this very beautiful light and shadow play, right? The chiaroscuro of light and shadow here is very sublime, where I essentially use the highlight weighted metering mode with all of my photos. So I expose for the highlights and crush the shadows. And that's how I get these deep black shadows in my photographs straight out of the camera. And so example number 5, we have pigeons at City Hall. Here in Philadelphia, we have so many pigeons that fly around our City Hall building here. It's a very beautiful building, and it's an iconic building that represents Philadelphia. We have William Penn on top of the building. And so I actually want to explain to you how I made this photograph and why this matters. So, you know, you see a photograph of pigeons in flight and you think, oh, that was lucky. How'd you get that pigeon in that spot, or this or that? And so I actually, you know, knew and had in the back of my head that I could potentially make a photograph of a pigeon interacting with the sculpture of William Penn on top of City Hall, because I would observe the patterns of nature and the way the light casts and the way the birds fly. And through going back to this same location with repetition, I essentially was able to come home with this composition by forcing my luck. And so you can see here, I was intrigued by the pigeons on these poles. I know that they're going to start flying soon. I'm observing the composition this way by including these different poles and structures within the frame, including that light post, including that signpost, including these different pigeons that are hanging out in context of the City Hall building so that I could fill the frame. And so that was my first compositional decision, and what drew me in. I was making photographs of this exact composition without that bird in flight. And then we have this beautiful light beam coming from the background. It's sunrise. We have that beautiful sunrise, those beautiful flares of light, and that adds visual interest to the frame and adds impact. And then finally, all I needed to do was wait for this interaction between the William Penn sculpture and the pigeon. And I genuinely, when I tell you, was waiting for this exact moment for weeks at end. I went back to this spot God knows how many times. I would go back here every single day for like a month straight, trying to see how I can align a pigeon in flight with William Penn. Because it's such an icon of Philadelphia, I just really wanted to get a good City Hall photograph, really. You know, I kept coming back to this building over and over again. And, you know, you see lots of cliche photos of this building. You see lots of, you know, regular photos of just William Penn on top of City Hall. But I wanted to get something a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic and spontaneous. And we have all of these pigeons flying around, so I would return to the same spot over and over again, and I would return at the same hour over and over again, right? And so this comes through discipline, consistency, and repetition, and studying the light, studying your hometown, studying the patterns in nature, whether it's the light, the pigeons in flight, human behavior, the way that they move, at what time of day people are on the sidewalk, right? So these kind of observation skills you must have and possess as a street photographer. But by combining those observation skills with consistency and discipline, you can actually become clairvoyant and predict things before they occur. And so force your luck. Repetition and consistency leads to success. You know, and I believe in this because it's something that I've achieved throughout my entire journey of practicing street photography for the past decade, is studying human behavior, studying light, studying shadows, studying the way that the streets operate on a day-to-day basis, and understanding the different potential photographs that I can make in my hometown. You know, this is something that I believe we can all achieve through consistency, discipline, and forcing your luck through practice, really, and having a vision and following through with that vision. And so hopefully you learned something today. If you would like to see more, please feel free to visit dantesisofo.com, or if you go to my YouTube channel, we have a playlist with the different lectures that I've been making on street photography, breaking down more ideas about the medium, about photographs in general. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.